For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. We are now in our fourth segment of the show, and like I said, we always had to transition from the NFL to college football sometimes, especially with the Week 10 slate for Saturday. Like this, a lot of huge games could determine CFP frontrunners and CFP pretenders. And a lot of it stems in the three major conference races, that can come down to a lot of different things. There are so many different stakes and so many different games that was tough to come up with. So many. That's why I had to limit myself to 3 this week, actually, in terms of whether it's importance or just fantasy excitement that could be generated from these games. But all 3 are still very important. I believe maybe one less so than the others. But I still think that no matter what, these games hold a lot of fantasy and real life weight for fantasy college and just regular college football fans as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Starting off with the one game that I feel like is lesser than the others, but not by much. An entertainment value which certainly makes up for itself in that department because of the dynamism both of these offenses could have. However, one offense has been weaker than the other, while the other offense has been more surprising than the other. And this is the Ole Miss-Arkansas game. This is a classic SEC rivalry that might not have as much meaning as we think, because Ole Miss, for all intents and purposes, at least in my opinion, is eliminated from the CFP, and Arkansas just playing for pride here and potentially playing spoiler over these next couple of weeks. They have a couple other ranked matchups as well, a big one being against Texas. So we'll see if they can pretend to play spoiler. But the reason why this game is so exciting is because of its fantasy implications. Because both of these offenses, yes, Ole Miss is being more disappointing, have the opportunity, though, to give you a lot of fantasy points. Jackson Dart is still a premier QB in the world of college football. Trey Harris is a fantastic receiver. And I feel like this team can be dynamic enough to still be an intriguing fantasy option for you week in and week out. But the reason why I'm so excited about this game on the other side of things is because I wasn't expecting Arkansas to really find its footing after such a player as KJ Jefferson left the program, because KJ Jefferson was such an exciting quarterback, was able to be one of those spoiler-like guys in the SEC that could ruin your favorite team's chances of making the Big Ten, the SEC championship game or even the CFP in the past. So that's why I feel like Arkansas is an even more appealing fantasy team in this one than Ole Miss, because Talon Green is a very exciting fantasy asset for you in fantasy college football. And I think that it's not just because of his dual threat ability, because of the weapons he has. I love Aaron Armstrong. I love Mark Redmond at the tight end position. There's so much versatility up and down this Arkansas roster that I can't ignore the factor that Arkansas right now could be the more appealing team. Andrew Armstrong is the name of their top receiver. Luke Haas, one of the top tight ends in college football this season. And so that's why, this game is so intriguing even though it doesn't have high stakes. I wanted to pick one game where, there was not such a pressure cooker environment surrounding it, and one game where you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the fun. And this Ole Miss-Arkansas game fits that description perfectly. Now, though, we have to get into the nitty-gritty, transitioning from the SEC to the Big Ten, where a lot of weight is being placed in this game, in the title race, in the CFP race, and most importantly for the pride of a team like Penn State. We talked about this game a lot this weekend. I talked about my experience going up there last weekend. Even in an away game, atmosphere was still electric. But this game, I feel like, stems on a lot of things. One, injuries, because that's an important factor for Ohio State along the offensive line, trying to protect their top valued fantasy assets for you in fantasy perspective, in Howard, Judkins, and Henderson. But also on the Penn State side of things, because it seems like I'm not necessarily correct in saying that Drew Aller will start this game out right. It seems like it's going to be a game-time decision, and Bo Prabula could have to step in. And so that leads to a lot of tension here, not just in real life, but trying to make fantasy college football decisions, because both of these QBs, Howard and Aller, you could say you can rely upon a lot more than other QBs this season from a fantasy perspective. Aller because of his big playability, Howard because of his efficiency and his experience at the college level. Both of them have their back against the wall. Aller might be playing a little bit gimpy in this one, and Howard's playing behind a far more weakened offensive line than we thought they would have at this point in the season. He's going to be playing with a third-string offensive tackle in that line, actually, because not only did Josh Simmons, who was backing up Ratledge, go down with injury, but his backup, Zen Michalski, goes down with the season-ending injury as well. So that offensive line is very banged up, and Penn State's defense is one that can very much take advantage of that. And even Nebraska's defense at times took advantage of it as well, so there are concerns there. But it's going to be all about the line of scrimmage. It's going to be all about, the importance of whether or not it's Drew Aller or Bo Prabula at the helm for Penn State. Because if it's Drew Aller, and you feel like you can make a big play on the field, you're not necessarily going to have to rely on Tyler Warren carrying a lot of the load as that tight end. But you're still going to, if it's Bo Prabula, have to find ways to generate yards, get points on the board, because Ohio State's not going anywhere in this one. Even though it's going to be at a raucous Beaver Stadium. I feel like this game's going to be a lot closer than people expect. I still think Ohio State is a slight favorite because I just like their team a little bit more than Penn State's right now. But it's still going to be a game coming down to the margins. And you might want to take a little bit more risks in this game from a fantasy perspective than you would in others because of the stakes of it as well. You never know who's going to shine. You could see a guy like Harrison Wallace step up. Penn State. You could see a guy like Ibuka have a big game other than Jeremiah Smith. You could see the Penn State defense really step up. You could see an Ohio State defense falter if they can't handle the big play threat or the decisions of James Franklin choosing who his quarterback's going to be for this game. So, look out for this to be a very, very weird rivalry game between these two Big Ten heavyweights. And the final game that I want to talk about for this segment is a game in the ACC. We're bouncing through all these different Power 4 conferences, but this game, I could have picked the Pitt SMU game, feels to me like a better fantasy game, and a game that could be a lot closer in real life than people realize. Louisville, Clemson. I don't necessarily have to tell Miami fans how close this game between Louisville and Clemson could be, because Louisville really put the scare into Miami a couple of weeks ago. And not for nothing, it's a talented team. There are concerns, though, about this defense. They've only generated 2 takeaways all season, but this offense could put up points, a little bit one of the most experienced QBs in the nation in Tyler Schaff. They have a decent offense. They have Ja'Cory Brooks as their top receiver, an Alabama transfer. Great physical route runner and receiver. Can make a lot of contested catches, and I really like the tenor of what they're building there at Louisville. On the Clemson side of things, though, if you are the Clemson Tigers, you should be very happy about your stretch after that season opening loss to Georgia. And I feel like, there's a lot to like heading into this matchup just because You feel like Cade Klubnik's finally developed into this elite quarterback a lot of people were expecting him to. He's not necessarily having to rely upon a guy like Phil Maffa too much. And he's getting the best out of a receiver core that, while it has a lot of young talent, wasn't necessarily seen as one of the most appealing in the country, let alone the ACC. And now it has become. You're seeing guys like Wesco and Moore step up for him. And he's become one of the premier talents at the QB position in college football. This is going to be a tough test for all concerned here, because Louisville is going to have to deal with this Clemson offense, but the Clemson defense is going to have to deal with this Louisville offense. And as opportunistic as this Clemson defense has been, and very solid throughout the Dabo Swinney era, and not just this year, Louisville presents a number of different challenges, and maybe Clemson's defense is better equipped to handle them than Miami's, but it should tell you something that one of the top teams, maybe perhaps your competitor and rival in the ACC championship game, struggled against this team. And that just goes to show the depth of the ACC, because, like I said, I could be talking about an entirely different game in the ACC. Pitt SMU could be in this spot. That's how deep the ACC is. That's how talented a lot of these teams are. And it's really going to come down to which one can handle their business in games like this. And let's be honest with you. If Louisville wins, they're right in the thick of the ACC title race as well. So a lot of high stakes in this one as well. Not just fantasy implications, not just pride implications here. But this is a true heavyweight match that could determine a lot that goes on in the ACC in the month of November. So it's going to be very exciting overall. All three of these games, no matter if you're just a casual college football fan or someone who has gone into fantasy college football, wants to dedicate their time to picking their lineups, this is definitely going to be a challenging week. Because, like I said, a lot of these games are going to hinge on a lot of different, diverse things. But it's up to you to really try and determine the decisions you have to make to truly see your fantasy college football team shine. But let me know what you think in the comments about these three games. When we come back, though, for our final segment of the day, we transition yet again to the NFL, specifically, yet again, the Sunday Night Football game, giving you some stardom cinema advice in that regard. Going to have to change a few things, but we'll be right back to talk about it after this short break. Welcome back. This will be the final segment of the day here, and the week for that matter, on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment, we are transitioning back to the NFL, specifically back to the matter of Sunday Night Football, this interesting, bizarre match between the Colts and Vikings. Now, it always feels like when I'm talking about primetime games, especially games that take place either Sunday or Monday night, a lot of weird things happen. As always, I'm telling you, I take these notes that I take way before any of the previous week's games have even been played. And so I can't necessarily account for all of these errors to be fixed or adjusted, but I'm going to go with the flow much like I did last week when the whole Jets-Steelers game became very bizarre. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it. I'm just going to go with the flow. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, because it is yet another interesting Sunday night primetime game in the NFL. So let's talk about the Colts side of things, because there's a more bizarre situation in the Vikings, and I feel like this is the one that I want to attack first, rather than, go to the Vikings, so I feel like are a little bit more clear-cut in this one. Now, I did say that despite, him actually being benched, that you should sit Anthony Richardson, so kudos to me for not, entirely screwing up there and saying, hey, why not start Anthony Richardson this week? So that, at the very least, is something that I'm proud of to say. But I still feel like, even though Joe Flacco brings a nice different flair to this Colts team, he's going to be a bit more safe than what Anthony Richardson presents. And maybe that's not a bad thing, especially for what the Colts might want out of their QB position right now. But I don't think it's going to be serviceable enough to warrant a quote-unquote full-on start. Maybe in a deeper Superflex league, you might be willing to take a flyer on him for this one game. But it just feels like he adds a dynamic to this team that is potentially going to win them more football games they would have with Anthony Richardson, but not necessarily in the prettiest of ways, and not necessarily in the most appealing of ways for fantasy football managers, if that makes sense. So I'd still say sit Joe Flacco. So that's one change that I would have to make. Even, if it were Anthony Richardson, then I would say either one of these Colts quarterbacks would have to sit this one out. And just starting, I turned back to two guys who I was trying to hype up a couple of weeks ago from the waiver wire. I feel like, with the status of Jonathan Taylor up in the air, it potentially a little bit more running-oriented plays being infused into this Colts team with Joe Flacco at the helm. Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson are two of the better backups in the league. So, if this whole Jonathan Taylor situation continues into Sunday night, and he's not playing, which I don't think he will, look for Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson to make some noise. Now, they haven't necessarily lit the world on fire ever since I talked about them on my waiver wire segment a couple weeks ago. They're still very serviceable guys. I still like them maybe as a flex option, maybe as an RB2, but certainly players that hold merit from a fantasy perspective now, especially if they're sticking with Joe Flacco for the long run, because he's someone who's going to have to rely a little bit more on the run game because he's not trying to create out of structure as much as Anthony Richardson could. So that's why Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson, now more than ever, feel like they could be potential boons to your fantasy team. Now let's talk about how this changes how I view the receiving core of the Indianapolis Colts, because with Joe Flacco in, it changes how I view their game plan, attacking a very, very aggressive Vikings defense. I feel like if it were Anthony Richardson, maybe there would be a couple more opportunities down the field for this Colts team because of the fact that, he's always going to have that propensity to throw the football deep, but because of the fact that the Vikings, because of their blitz package, would be a little bit light in their secondary. But with Flacco now, I feel like the weapons who I thought would have succeeded in this game might not get opportunities to. For example, Alec Pierce and A.D. Mitchell as deep threats might not prove to be the best options for you in this game anymore. So that's why I feel like guys like Downs and Pittman, who feel like more versatile, savvy route runners than the Pierces and Mitchells of the Colts, can pretend to be a little bit more dynamic in this game with Flacco thrown to them. So that's one thing I would change. I did have Alec Pierce as potential start option for this game, but I feel like that will have to change because with the new addition of Flacco, I feel like the Colts are going to play a little bit safer, try to play the ball retention game, try and control the football for as long as possible, and thus guys like Pierce and Mitchell won't be seeing a lot of deep ball opportunities. But it's something that we saw in Cleveland with Joe Flacco that potentially happened in Sunday night, actually. But it's going to depend on the Colts' game plan. And I feel like it could be very different now because of the fact that Joe Flacco isn't as versatile out of structure as Anthony Richardson. And that's one reason why I feel like the deep ball is not going to be as active as I would think in this one. So that's why I feel like starting Josh Downs and Michael Pittman will make sense, and sitting Alec Pierce out, at least for this week, could be beneficial. Now let's get into the Vikings side of things, because this is a team that I feel like is a little bit more clear-cut. We know who the fantasy stars are, and we know who the fantasy goats are, I feel like, at this point in the season. And I feel like the two easiest starts, when we talked about already, is Aaron Jones, but also Justin Jefferson. You always have to consider these two as the cream of the crop when we're talking about the Vikings from a fantasy perspective. We know that, Justin Jefferson might not always be the most appealing option, especially because, Sam Darnold seems like the guy who's trying to incorporate as many different players as possible into this offensive game plan for the Vikings. But Justin Jefferson just will always be a guy who's going to be in that star conversation for this team. And in the grand scheme of things, he's going to frustrate a lot of defenses like the Colts. And going forward, maybe there are going to be matchups where you feel like he's not the right fit. But in games that are winnable and manageable for Minnesota, I can't say he's not a no-brainer. And then on the Jones side of things, it's just that the Colts run defense, and their defense in general is just appallingly bad. And I feel like because of the fact we already know these Minnesota guys are fantasy studs and can produce for you week in, week out, why bench them now in this kind of game? You can bench them against divisional opponents perhaps, or harder matchups that they'll face down the stretch, but in this game, it certainly feels like you can empty the tank with all these Minnesota players on your fantasy football squad. Then let's get into the interesting proposition of TJ Hawkinson starting and how that means for this Vikings. Now, that could mean, potentially that Aaron Jones might not get as many touches because Sam Darnold now has the middle of the field target that he so desperately missed. And so, looking at how this could change the game plan for the Vikings, I feel like, he's going to be more in this game, especially of a security blanket, than, a true go-to weapon in the early goings here. Not to say that this indictment of TJ Hawkinson saying that he can't be a valuable asset going forward from a fantasy perspective, but it's still something to have note of because he is someone who I feel is still going to be valuable, but not as much as you would think in this Vikings house because it looks like it was able to operate without him either way. Munt was serviceable enough at that position, with receivers like Naylor and Powell stepping up, and you still feel like Jordan Addison could be a weapon down the stretch for them. But it's all dependent on, how Kevin O'Connell feels about what Sam Darnold needs. And I feel at this point, having a guy like TJ Hawkinson helps a lot, but it could also lead to some more erratic play from Sam Darnold, trying to force different situations to happen. And I feel like, now with all these superstars that he has at disposal, it could be a bit of a conundrum figuring out who gets the burden of the targets. And I still think it will be Justin Jefferson, but this Vikings offense, the sky's the limit for them. It can either crumble or it can either be elevated because of what TJ Hawkinson can bring. That being said, though, call me weird for this, but I feel like sitting Sam Darnold feels a bit right. Because I feel like, taking advantage of the run game is one thing, but, trying to incorporate so many different things could be a little bit confusing to start for Sam Darnold. And I feel like, yes, it's the Colts, and you feel like he can take advantage of them, but it's a weird situation. So it's one that I would shy away from thus far. But overall, looking at this game now, there certainly feels like there's a different flair there than there was before. It certainly is a little bit more chaotic to try and navigate, especially on the Colts side of things. On the Viking side of things, even those chalk players could feel like they're not necessarily going to have the best of games. Just because of what this Vikings offense can look like going forward. Maybe they're going to struggle early on in this period, rather than, immediately look like what we expect them to. Let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for the show. Thank you all for tuning in throughout the week to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Christopher Shepard. Thank you for tuning in all week. If you want more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network. It's a great way to interact with the show, but if you want to interact more directly with other shows, including my own, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, have a great weekend. Enjoy your football. I'm out till Monday, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.